The rhythmic clatter of plastic cutlery against ceramic plates was the loudest sound in the mess hall during lockdown, a constant low-frequency hum beneath the drone of the ventilation system. I preferred the periphery, a table tucked into an alcove where the fluorescent lights didn't hum quite so aggressively. My current research, a dense manuscript on forgotten architectural theories, demanded my full, undivided attention, and this facility, for all its sterile blandness, offered just that, an unbroken stretch of solitude. My days here were a predictable loop. Wake, work, eat, work, sleep. The outside world, with its incessant demands and fleeting concerns, felt like a distant, irrelevant rumor. That was precisely how I liked it. People, with their unpredictable emotional currents, were an unnecessary complication. Give me a stack of dusty tomes and a quiet room, and I was content. I was halfway through a particularly uninspired plate of what the facility's cook insisted was chicken surprise. The surprise being how little it resembled chicken. When the facility's administrator, a portly woman with an unfortunate fondness for synthetic fabrics, approached my table. Her presence was unusual. Usually I was left alone, a quiet fixture in the background, acknowledged only when my meal card needed swiping. "Marcus," he said, his voice a little too loud for the quiet hum of the room, causing a few heads to swivel in our direction. I merely raised an eyebrow, a silent invitation for her to state her business and retreat. I disliked being the object of even casual scrutiny. She held a thick, cream-colored envelope, its edges crisp and official-looking. It was devoid of a return address, sealed with a dark wax stamp I couldn't quite decipher from my seat. "This arrived for you. Special delivery. The courier insisted it be handed to you personally." My gaze drifted from her outstretched hand to the envelope, then back to my half-eaten meal. "I'm not expecting anything." My voice was flat, devoid of curiosity. Expectation was a vulnerability I rarely indulged. "Nevertheless," she pressed, her synthetic blouse rustling as she shifted her weight. He was quite insistent. Said it was time-sensitive. Reluctantly, I took the envelope. Its weight felt substantial, out of place in my ordered, Spartan existence. The paper felt heavy, thick, almost archaic. I turned it over in my hand, my thumb tracing the raised impression of the wax seal. It was an ornate, almost Gothic B. Blackwood. The name flickered in the recesses of my memory, a half-forgotten whisper from a childhood I had long since excised from my active thoughts. "Thank you," I mumbled, dismissing her. She lingered for a moment, perhaps hoping for a dramatic reveal, but I offered nothing. With a sigh that rustled her blouse again, she turned and made her way back to the serving line. I set the envelope beside my plate, its unusual presence a stark contrast to the utilitarian surroundings. The chicken surprise suddenly seemed even less appetizing. My appetite, in fact, had vanished. The B on the wax seal continued to needle at me, a persistent itch in the calm landscape of my mind. After finishing my lukewarm tea, I pushed my plate aside and picked up the envelope again. The formal script of my name, Marcus Thorne, was etched across the front in an elegant, almost calligraphic hand. It felt like something pulled from a different century. I broke the seal carefully, the wax cracking with a soft, brittle sound. Inside were several folded sheets of similarly heavy paper, along with a smaller folded document. The scent that wafted from the envelope was faint but distinct. Old paper, dust, and something else. Something dry and earthy, like forgotten leaves. The first page was a formal letter from a legal firm I'd never heard of, based in a remote coastal town I vaguely remembered existing on a map from my childhood. I skimmed the opening lines, my eyes catching on key phrases. "It is with formal regret. Passing of your great-aunt, Ilara Thorne. Ancestral estate, Blackwood Manor. Sole beneficiary. My great-aunt Ilara." The name stirred nothing. My family, what little remained of it, had been a concept, not a presence, for decades. I had consciously severed those ties, choosing the quiet certainty of academia over the volatile unpredictability of familial obligation. The name, when read in stark print, solidified the nagging echo in my mind. It wasn't just a house. It was a legend, whispered in hushed tones by the few relatives who had tried to maintain contact in my youth. A sprawling, isolated estate, perched on a craggy cliff overlooking the churning gray of the North Sea. There were hushed mentions of the Thorne family's peculiarities, of generations consumed by a melancholic introspection that bordered on madness. I'd always dismissed them as the dramatic embellishments of provincial gossip, designed to add spice to otherwise dull lives. My own reclusive nature, I told myself, was a matter of intellectual preference, not some inherited affliction. The letter detailed the property. Acres of untamed woodland, a neglected garden, the manor itself, a Gothic monstrosity of gray stone and twisting chimneys. It specified that my presence was required within 3 weeks to formally accept the inheritance and discuss the estate's considerable, if somewhat mysterious, assets. A series of clauses outlined my obligations, the most prominent being the requirement to reside on the property for at least 6 months to ensure its proper stewardship. 6 months. Away from my research, away from the predictable rhythms of the facility, away from the quiet certainty I had meticulously built around myself. The thought was jarring, an unwelcome disruption. Blackwood Manor wasn't an opportunity. It was an imposition. I picked up the smaller folded document. It was a single sheet, thick and yellowed, with spidery, looping handwriting that was difficult to decipher. It wasn't from the legal firm. This was a personal note. Marcus, it began, the ink faded but distinct. If you are reading this, then I am gone. And Blackwood calls to you now, as it always does to the blood. Do not deny what flows in your veins. It needs you. And you. You will learn to need it too. There are things here, old things. They remember. My great-aunt, I remembered, had been considered eccentric even by the family's standards. Her pronouncements were often dramatic, her insights unsettlingly precise. I looked around the mess hall. The other residents, mostly fellow academics and researchers, continued their meals, lost in their own thoughts or quiet conversations. The fluorescent lights hummed. The air conditioning whirred. Everything was ordered, logical, predictable. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a distinct, unsettling tension coil in my stomach. The isolation I had sought here suddenly felt fragile, easily breached. The last of the paved road crumbled into a gravel track, swallowed by encroaching forest. The engine of my old sedan grumbled in protest, spitting pebbles as I navigated the winding, overgrown path. Sunlight, already weak, struggled to pierce the dense canopy of ancient oaks and towering pines that pressed in on either side. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The world outside my dusty windows felt increasingly remote, a deliberate retreat from everything familiar. My great-aunt's warning, "Be careful what you forget," echoed, a low thrum against the rising anticipation in my chest. What was I expecting to find here anyway? Solitude, yes. A quiet place for my research, certainly. But also, something else. An answer, perhaps, to the gnawing emptiness that had settled in me since my family's slow, quiet vanishing act. Finally, the trees parted. Blackwood Manor didn't just appear, it loomed. It was less a house and more a fortress, a hulking silhouette against the bruised afternoon sky. 3 stories of dark, weathered stone, punctuated by dozens of blank, staring windows. Gables and turrets jutted at odd angles, like the broken teeth of some colossal beast. A thick ivy, centuries old, scaled its walls, a verdant shroud clinging to every crack and crevice. The driveway, once grand, was now a fractured mosaic of weeds and moss. Iron gates, rusted shut and draped with more ivy, stood as a forlorn testament to a time when visitors were expected. It carried the metallic tang of distant rain and the earthy scent of something old and deeply rooted. I stood there for a long moment, my gaze tracing the manor's imposing lines. It wasn't just old. It felt ancient, burdened by forgotten stories. There was no welcoming warmth, no inviting glow from within. Getting inside proved to be an exercise in stubborn determination. The main gate was an immovable monument to neglect. I followed the crumbling perimeter wall until I found a service entrance, a smaller wrought iron gate that had sagged off its hinges. It groaned like a dying thing as I forced it open, the sound scraping against the quiet. The path beyond led to the rear of the manor, through what must have once been meticulously kept gardens. Now a wild tangle of thorny bushes and skeletal rose canes. The back door, a heavy oak slab, was similarly resistant. The key, a monstrous iron thing from the collection the lawyer had given me, finally turned with a reluctant click. I found myself in a cavernous hallway, stripped bare of furniture but lined with faded silk damask wallpaper that peeled like sunburnt skin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows. My footsteps raised tiny clouds of it, a fine powder that coated everything. I moved from room to room on the ground floor, each a testament to a grand past and a forgotten present. The drawing room, with its enormous fireplace and gilded cornices, held only draped sheets over skeletal furniture, like ghosts awaiting an audience. The library, its shelves empty save for a few forgotten leather-bound tomes, smelled of aged paper and dry rot. My exploration eventually led me to a less formal wing of the house, a warren of smaller rooms and narrow corridors that felt distinctly different from the stately main halls. The wallpaper was simpler, the floorboards bare, scuffed, and deeply grooved. This wing clearly hadn't seen a resident in perhaps a century. It was utilitarian, built for service rather than display. I pushed open a heavy, unpainted door. The room beyond was vast, long, and stark. Empty wooden tables, scarred and stained, stretched down its length, flanked by rows of backless benches. The windows were high and narrow, almost like slits, letting in only grudging slivers of gray light. The air here was heavy, still, and charged with an almost palpable sense of past activity, of many voices, many bodies. This was clearly a mess hall. But it wasn't just abandoned. It felt sealed off. The windows were boarded from the outside, not just shuttered, and the heavy door I'd entered through had a series of rusted internal bolts designed to be secured from within. It hit me then, a disquieting thought. This wasn't just a forgotten service area. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my boots scuffing on the concrete. It was a metal disc, tarnished with age, about the size of my palm. I picked it up. Etched into its surface, crudely but deeply, was a single, unsettling symbol. A stylized eye, weeping a single, jagged tear. It wasn't a family crest I recognized, nor any common motif. It felt ancient, primal, and utterly alien. This house, I realized, was not just old. It was a vessel, and I had just stepped inside. Days had blurred since my arrival, each one a painstaking effort to impose order on the chaos of inherited neglect. I'd set up a makeshift study in what used to be a library, the shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their titles obscured by decades of dust. This was where I intended to lose myself in the family archives, to unravel the threads of my lineage, to understand the dark history whispered about in hushed tones by distant relatives I barely remembered. One afternoon, I was meticulously cataloging a stack of brittle ledgers, my fingers stained with the fine powder of decaying paper. I needed my magnifying glass, a brass-framed antique I'd brought specifically for this purpose. I distinctly remembered placing it on the corner of the heavy oak desk, right beside the inkwell. I'd used it just minutes before to decipher a faded inscription. Now, it wasn't there. I scoured the desktop, pushed aside stacks of papers, checked under the ledgers. Nothing. A sigh escaped me. Absent-mindedness, Marcus, I chided myself, rubbing my temples. It's the isolation getting to you. I found it eventually, nestled among a pile of unrelated maps on a side table across the room, a place I was certain I hadn't put it. A fleeting prickle of unease, easily dismissed as the quirks of an old house or my own scattered thoughts. The following evening, as a storm rattled the window panes, I was engrossed in a particularly dense genealogical chart. The wind howled like a mournful beast, but beneath its roar, I caught something else. Faint, indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, but with a definite cadence, a breathy articulation. I paused, my pen hovering over the parchment. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the cavernous room. Only the wind answered, sighing through cracks I hadn't noticed. I listened intently, straining my ears, but the sound didn't return. It must have been the old timbers groaning, I decided, or a trick of the swirling air currents. This house had 1,000 voices, none of them human. I tried to convince myself. Days turned into a week. The incidents became more frequent, more insistent. My spectacles, always on my nose or on the desk, would vanish only to reappear on a high shelf I couldn't reach without a chair. The heavy parlor door, which I'd always kept ajar, would be found firmly shut, the latch clicked into place. Each time I turned, each time I focused, there was nothing. Just the static grandeur of the house, mocking my attempts to find an explanation. My heart, a steady drum normally, began to beat with a quickened rhythm, a persistent unease settling deep in my gut. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten wings and sealed-off chambers. Following a narrow, dust-choked corridor on the ground floor, I pushed open a massive iron-strapped door that groaned in protest. I stepped into a vast, echoing space, sparsely lit by high, grime-coated windows that offered only slivers of the weak morning sun. It was unlike any other room I'd found. Long, scarred wooden tables stretched across the expanse, flanked by heavy, backless benches. At one end, a colossal soot-stained hearth hinted at past feasts, while opposite it, a row of dilapidated cupboards stood like sentinels, their doors hanging askew. The room had a stark, utilitarian feel, utterly devoid of the ornate flourishes that characterized the rest of the house. It felt less like a grand hall, and more like a place of forced communal gathering, a space designed for feeding many, quickly, efficiently. The thick walls seemed to absorb all sound, trapping it, creating an atmosphere of profound isolation. I felt an inexplicable urge to turn and flee, a primal sense of being confined, observed. Then it happened again. Clearer this time. A breath, a sigh right beside my ear, followed by a low, guttural murmur that was almost a word. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I would see something. But there was only the empty space, the long tables stretching into the gloom, the vacant benches. Yet, the air in that precise spot where I'd heard the sound felt strangely disturbed, a ripple in the stillness, like someone had just exhaled. I backed away slowly, my gaze sweeping the room, searching for a source, a trick of the acoustics, anything to explain it. There was nothing. I left the mess hall, pulling the heavy door shut behind me with a resounding thud that echoed through the silent corridor. My hands were shaking. The rational explanations, the convenient dismissals, were starting to fray at the edges. My imagination? Fatigue? The age of the house? They felt like flimsy excuses now, thin veils over something far more unsettling. I was no longer simply alone in an old house. I was being watched. I was being toyed with. About my perception? What if the house wasn't just old, but aware? My initial determination, a stubborn refusal to be daunted by the estate's imposing facade, was slowly being chipped away, not by grand, terrifying events, but by a creeping, insidious erosion. It started subtly, like a pebble dislodging from a cliff face, barely noticed until it gathered momentum. I remembered, with absolute clarity, a conversation I'd had with the estate manager just a few mornings prior. We'd been discussing the ancient oak in the West Garden, its roots threatening the foundations of the old conservatory. I distinctly recalled telling him to prioritize its removal, citing structural integrity. Yet, when I saw him later, meticulously pruning roses near the south wall, I asked if he'd contacted the arborists. He looked at me, a polite but bewildered expression on his weathered face. "Arborists, Marcus?" he'd said, his voice raspy. "We spoke about the conservatory, yes. But you said to leave the oak for now, that the conservatory could wait until after you'd had a chance to properly assess the full extent of the damage yourself. Said you didn't trust anyone else with it." My brow furrowed. That wasn't right. I had not said that. I had been emphatic about the oak. I remembered the exact words, the firm tone I'd used. "No, I'm quite sure I told you to," I trailed off, seeing the genuine confusion in his eyes. He wasn't lying. He truly believed I had said what he claimed. Had I? A flicker of doubt, cold and unwelcome, brushed against my mind. I dismissed it. A momentary lapse, perhaps due to the sheer volume of instructions I'd been issuing since I arrived. "My mistake," I mumbled, feeling a prickle of unease. Too many things on my mind. He nodded, accepting my explanation, but the incident gnawed at me. Then came the misplaced items. My spectacles, for instance. I'd set them down on my desk, right beside the stack of crumbling family journals I was attempting to decipher. I remembered the glint of light on the gold frames as I turned to consult a reference book. When I reached for them a moment later, they were gone. I searched the desk, then the floor, the surrounding shelves. Nothing. An hour later, frustrated, I found them tucked neatly into the pocket of a tweed jacket hanging in the hallway coat rack. A jacket I hadn't worn in days, a jacket I certainly hadn't put my spectacles into. It was illogical. It was impossible. Yet, there they were. Stress, I told myself, running a hand through my already disheveled hair. Just stress and the general disarray of this place. The real unsettling shift, the one that truly began to prickle the hairs on my neck, involved my research notes. I was trying to reconstruct a timeline of the family's presence in this house, meticulously cross-referencing old letters, property deeds, and local historical records. I had a detailed outline, a chronological progression of ownership and significant events, laid out in a leather-bound folio. One afternoon, after an hour spent wrestling with the house's ancient plumbing, I returned to my study, eager to add a new discovery about a distant ancestor. I opened the folio. My eyes immediately snagged on a passage I knew, with every fiber of my being I had not written. Under the heading 1888, The Great Fire, I had always recorded a brief note about the West Wing being partially damaged, then rebuilt. A cessation of all sounds, a profound emptiness that swallowed even thought. The words were undeniably mine, the ink matching my pen, the loops and slants characteristic of my handwriting. But the content, it was gibberish, nonsensical, a macabre poem that had no place in my factual research. What was that? I flipped back, then forward. Other entries seemed fine, but this one stood out like a festering wound. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure the memory of writing it, of thinking it. Just a blank, echoing space where that memory should have been. A growing paranoia began to take hold. It wasn't just stress. It wasn't just the house's chaos. Something was happening. Something was subtly, insidiously reaching into my mind, plucking out threads and weaving in its own twisted tapestry. I gripped the folio, my knuckles white, a desperate silent plea forming on my lips. "What are you doing to me?" My breath hitched, a cold, sharp intake that burned in my throat. But the content? And the mess hall during lockdown? What was that? I had no memory of writing it, no memory of such a place, not in my life, not in my research. My mind raced, clawing at the edges of a void. It felt like a dream, a half-remembered nightmare, but the solid paper beneath my fingers, the weight of the journal in my hand, was all too real. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them until colored lights exploded behind my eyelids. No, this couldn't be. Perhaps I'd been overtired, scribbled something nonsensical in a fugue state. But the precision of the handwriting, the confident flow of the pen, it didn't look like tired scrawl. It looked deliberate. A tremor started in my hands, spreading up my arms. This wasn't just misplaced notes or forgotten research. This was a crack in the foundation of my own mind. My identity, my memories. They were the bedrock of who I was. If those could be tampered with, what was left? I had to understand. With a sudden, fierce resolve, I pushed the disturbing note aside. This wasn't the time for panic. It was time for answers. My family, this estate, the strange occurrences, they were all connected. I needed to dig deeper, beyond my recent research, into the very history of this place and the people who had lived here before me. There had to be something. A journal, a letter, anything that might shed light on this insidious unraveling. The grand, decaying library was my first thought. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light filtering through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating shelves upon shelves of forgotten knowledge. The air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of aged paper and dry rot. I ran my fingers along leather-bound spines, some crumbling to the touch, others still firm despite their age. Genealogical records, local histories, obscure scientific texts, a lifetime of accumulated intellectual detritus. It contained a few worn ledgers and a handful of personal diaries, distinct from the more formal historical texts. One in particular caught my eye. A thick, leather-bound volume, its cover embossed with a faded, intricate crest that I vaguely recognized as my family's. It felt cool and heavy in my hands, its pages brittle with age. No title, no author listed, just the crest, an ancestral journal. I carried it to a sturdy, if dusty, oak table and carefully opened it. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was clear, if somewhat florid. The first entries were mundane, detailing weather, harvests, social calls. But as I turned the pages, a subtle shift occurred. The entries became more introspective, more troubled. The days blur, like watercolors in a sudden rain, I read, the words of an ancestor from nearly 2 centuries ago. I find myself in rooms I do not recall entering, speaking with faces I cannot place. My studies, once so sharp, now feel like sand slipping through my fingers. They see the vacant stare, the lost expression. The affliction. It sounded so similar to my own experiences. I hurried through the pages, skipping over the more mundane entries, searching for the core of the ancestors' torment. Today, I awoke in the East Wing's unused parlor. Another entry read, penned in a hand that was beginning to show signs of strain, the letters less uniform. No memory of having gone there. It clung to me. My notes, my precious notes on the celestial movements, they are scattered, some pages entirely gone. It is as if a mischievous hand plays games with my mind, or perhaps with my very being. My breath hitched again. Pages entirely gone. This wasn't just confusion, it was erasure, just like my own notes, my own memories. The parallel was stark, terrifying. This wasn't a unique torment. It was a legacy. I continued reading, my eyes scanning for any hint, any explanation. The entries grew more erratic, more desperate. The ancestor described disorienting shifts in their surroundings, moments where the house felt different, alien. They spoke of a peculiar echo, a sound like distant, muffled voices that seemed to resonate from the very stones of the manor. They wrote of a constant sense of being observed, even when alone. The steward found me in the old larder, surrounded by empty barrels. A later entry detailed, the handwriting now visibly trembling, some words almost illegible. I had no recollection of entering the space, nor of the hours I must have spent there. I swear I heard the faint clatter of metal, the drone of voices, as if from a great distance, yet impossibly close. It was a space I knew. For holding. The words resonated with an unsettling familiarity, like a forgotten chord struck deep within me. Was it possible my ancestor had experienced something similar? A disorienting, confined space that made no sense in the context of the manor? The final entries were barely decipherable, a frantic scrawl of fragmented thoughts and escalating fear. It takes pieces, not just memories. The self, they move. It seeks to remake, to erase. The last page was ripped, leaving the sentence unfinished, a jagged edge of paper mocking any hope of a conclusion. I closed the journal, the heavy leather thudding softly. This wasn't madness, not entirely. This was a pattern, a cycle. My ancestor had suffered this same insidious erasure, this slow, agonizing theft of identity within these very walls. And now it was happening to me. The affliction had returned, and I was its latest victim. The mess hall, the larder, they were symptoms of a deeper, more ancient horror tied to my bloodline and this cursed house. And I was trapped, watching myself disappear, piece by agonizing piece. It wasn't a dream, not exactly, but a phantom echo, a whisper of something profoundly out of place, yet undeniably familiar. I tried to shake it off, the way one sheds a persistent chill, but the words had burrowed deep, leaving a faint metallic taste in my mouth. My rational mind, the academic part of me that craved order and explanation, struggled to categorize it. A stray thought? A fragment of something I'd read, perhaps? But the feeling it evoked was too raw, too personal. I pushed back the heavy duvet, the rough linen cool against my skin. The morning light, usually a muted gray through the ancient panes, seemed oddly sharper, too bright, almost clinical. I blinked, rubbing at my eyes, convinced it was just a trick of my vision. I opened the pantry, reaching for the coffee beans, but my fingers met empty air. I frowned. I always kept the fresh bag on the top shelf behind the tins of tea. I scanned the shelves, my gaze sweeping over the jars of spices and canned goods before finally spotting it. Not on the top shelf, but tucked away on the bottom, partially obscured by a stack of old cookbooks I rarely touched. Odd, I muttered, retrieving the bag. I was particular about my pantry. A place for everything, and everything in its place. Had I been so preoccupied yesterday that I'd put it away haphazardly? It was unlike me. As the scent of brewing coffee began to fill the kitchen, I noticed something else. The small framed print of a local landscape, a gift from a colleague years ago, usually hung on the wall beside the back door. Now it was on the wall opposite, above the small chipped ceramic sink. I stopped, the warmth of the coffee mug seeping into my hands, and stared. No, that wasn't right. It had always been by the back door. I distinctly remembered looking at it while waiting for the kettle to boil countless times. A prickle of unease started to spread through me. Had I moved it? Why would I? It was a small, insignificant thing, but the certainty of its original position was absolute. I walked over, my brow furrowed, and ran a finger over the wall where it should have been. No faint mark, no lighter patch where it had hung for years. It was as if it had simply materialized on the other wall. I dismissed it, again, as my own absent-mindedness, a side effect of too much solitary thinking. Perhaps I had moved it subconsciously, a restless hand seeking minor rearrangement. But the feeling persisted as I moved into my study, my sanctuary of books and research. My desk, usually a carefully organized landscape of open texts, scattered notes, and a perpetually half-empty teacup, was different. My favorite fountain pen, a sturdy brass instrument I used for all my annotations, was not in its usual leather stand. Instead, it lay across the spine of a closed volume of medieval history, a book I hadn't touched in weeks. My reading spectacles, which I'd left on the open page of my current manuscript, were gone. I was getting sloppy, forgetful. The isolation was getting to me. My gaze kept drifting. The bookshelves, always a familiar comfort, seemed off. It looked like it had been pulled out slightly, creating a narrow, almost imperceptible gap. And the collection of antique maps, meticulously arranged by region, seemed to have shifted. A map of the British Isles, which I knew to be on the second shelf, was now on the fourth, replaced by a chart of the Mediterranean that had no business being there. This wasn't absent-mindedness. This wasn't me. I stood, a sudden urgency propelling me. I needed to reorient myself to prove that my memory wasn't failing. I walked out of the study, down the main hallway that led to the drawing room. This hallway, I remembered with crystal clarity, had 3 large tapestries depicting hunting scenes. I counted them as I walked. 1, 2, 3. But as I reached the end, a distinct icy wave of disorientation washed over me. The hallway felt longer. Not just a subjective feeling, but physically, tangibly longer. And the third tapestry, it was different. It was not a tapestry I owned. It was not a tapestry I had ever seen. My breath hitched. The skeletal figure remained, its vacant gaze seeming to pierce through me. Then, a flicker at the periphery of my vision. For a split second, the polished floorboards of the hallway seemed to give way to worn, gray concrete. The ornate sconces on the wall dissolved into bare, exposed pipes, and the heavy oak doors warped into stark, unpainted metal. A faint, acrid smell, like stale disinfectant and something metallic, filled my nostrils. The image was fleeting, gone before I could fully grasp it. But it was enough. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to the wall for support. The rough plaster felt real, solid, but my mind reeled. I retreated, practically running back down the hallway, past the horrifying tapestry, past the shifting bookshelves in my study. I needed my journal, my meticulous record of my time here, to verify what was real and what was not. I had left it on my bedside table last night, open to a fresh page, ready for my morning reflections. I burst into my bedroom, my chest heaving. The room, too, felt subtly altered, the angles of the furniture just a fraction off, the light filtering in with an almost greenish tint. My eyes scanned the bedside table. Empty. I tore through the room, flinging open drawers, overturning cushions, my hands trembling. It wasn't there. My journal, the anchor of my sanity, was gone. And then I saw it. Not my journal, but something else. Tucked beneath the edge of my mattress, half hidden, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It looked like a crow, but twisted, malignant. I had never, ever seen this object before in my life. It was alien, an intruder. This wasn't just things being out of place. This wasn't just my memory playing tricks. This was the house itself, a living, breathing thing, shifting around me, erasing my world and replacing it with its own grotesque reality. And this bird, a warning. I found myself drawn, as if by an invisible thread, to the sprawling, seldom-used dining hall. The room was immense, designed for ancestral gatherings that hadn't occurred in decades, now a tomb of polished mahogany and fading tapestries. I was determined to understand this erosion, to catalog its patterns, to fight back. As I reached the far end of the long dining table, a shiver, sharper than any draft, raked down my spine. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was an absence of warmth, a vacuum that sucked the heat from the air around me. My breath plumed, a startled cloud in the stale air. The ornate chandelier above, usually a dull glitter of crystal, seemed to dim, its facets absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. It felt personal, targeted. Then came the pressure. It wasn't physical weight, no hand on my shoulder, no wall closing in. It was internal, a dull ache behind my eyes that spread to my temples, a sensation of atmospheric compression that made my ears pop, then ring. My lungs felt constricted, as if the air itself had grown heavy, viscous. The tapestries on the walls, depicting forgotten hunting scenes, seemed to ripple, their threads blurring into indistinct shapes. The polished surface of the dining table elongated, its rich mahogany hue fading to a scarred, institutional gray. A faint, acrid smell, like stale disinfectant mixed with something metallic and unwashed, began to prickle my nostrils. The room was changing, or rather, my perception of it was. The high, vaulted ceiling pressed down, becoming lower, more utilitarian. The grand fireplace, once a focal point, dissolved into a stark, unadorned wall. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a low, oppressive hum, punctuated by what sounded like distant, muffled clatter. Trays, perhaps, or cutlery. I stood there, rooted, as the opulent dining hall dissolved around me, replaced by an austere, echoing chamber. The long table became a series of scratched communal surfaces. The air grew thick with the phantom scent of boiled vegetables and institutional-grade cleaner. The muffled clatter intensified, becoming the unmistakable sound of metal on metal, of hundreds of people moving in unison, yet without a sound. This wasn't a memory I recognized, not consciously, yet the shift was absolute. This wasn't a hallucination born of fatigue. This was too vivid, too real, too encompassing. This was an active, malevolent force at play, bending my reality. And then, the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere. A voice that seemed to speak inside my skull even as it resonated in the air. "Marcus," it rasped, a sound that felt like sandpaper against my eardrums. "You forgot the name of your first pet. A terrier, scruffy, with one floppy ear. You called him Barnaby." A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me. Barnaby. The name. It was true. The entity wasn't just taking. It was playing. It was showing me what it had taken, proving its power. "You forgot the color of your mother's favorite shawl," the voice continued, its tone mocking, possessive. "Indigo, frayed at the edges. She wore it when she read to you." Indigo. The pressure intensified, a vice tightening around my head. This wasn't a ghost in the conventional sense. This was something that consumed identity, that weaponized memory. It wasn't just haunting the house, it was haunting me. This wasn't my declining mind. This wasn't a trick of the old house. There was something else here, something ancient and hungry, living within these walls. And it had been with me for far longer than I had understood. It was actively stripping me bare, and it reveled in showing me the empty spaces it left behind. My determination to understand had just become a desperate fight for my very being. The revelation from the previous night had stripped away the last vestiges of my self-delusion. My memory wasn't failing. It was being taken. The house wasn't just old and unsettling. It was a cage, and I, the latest occupant, was the prey. The urgency of that understanding had propelled me through the night, a frantic energy keeping me from sleep. It was a vast, echoing room on the lower level, far from the grand dining room. This space had once served a more utilitarian purpose, perhaps for servants or staff, with its long, scarred wooden tables and high, grimy windows that now offered only slivers of the overcast morning light. I had dragged several of the tables together, creating a sprawling command center for my desperate research. the sheer volume of papers a chaotic testament to my single-minded pursuit. Dust motes danced in the weak light, illuminated by the beam of my lamp, a silent, swirling audience to my panic. The air hung thick with the scent of aged paper, mildew, and something else. A faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. My fingers, smudged with ink and grime, trembled as I flipped through a heavy, leather-bound volume. It was a family chronicle, meticulously kept by an ancestor, a woman named Eleanor from the late 17th century. Her cursive, once elegant, had grown spidery and erratic in the later entries. I had been skipping through these, looking for anything out of place, anything beyond the mundane records of births and deaths. And then I saw it. His laughter, once bright, now hollows into a vacant stare. A silence descends where joy once was. Another entry, a few months later. My own memories begin to fray at the edges. Names slip like water through my grasp. This wasn't just old family drama or a poetic turn of phrase. This was a description of precisely what I was experiencing. A shiver traced its way up my spine, despite the relative warmth of the room. I felt a subtle pressure, like a hand pressed lightly against the back of my skull, trying to pry something loose. I pushed the Eleanor Chronicle aside, my eyes scanning the other documents. There were letters, wills, even a few children's drawings. Nothing seemed to connect, just a jumble of fragmented lives. My frustration mounted, a hot, bitter taste in my mouth. I slammed my fist lightly on the table, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. The small sound echoed unnaturally in the cavernous room. Then, tucked beneath a stack of invoices, I found a slim, unbound journal. This one was different. No grand pronouncements, no formal entries. The author was unnamed, but the voice felt desperate, raw. It watches, it waits, and it feeds. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped within my chest. I leaned closer, my lamp casting a stark pool of light on the page. It is bound to the blood, to the Blackwood line. A parasite, not of flesh, but of essence. The words were a hammer blow, striking at the core of my being. I could almost taste the fear of the person who had written these lines. I turned the page, my fingers trembling so violently I almost tore the delicate paper. It preys upon the mind, the memories, the very identity of those who dwell here. An empty vessel, ready to be filled, ready to be used. The blood drained from my face. My hands, which had been gripping the journal, fell limp. This wasn't just memory loss. This wasn't just a slow decline. It was a deliberate, malevolent process. It wasn't trying to make me mad. It was trying to erase me. The faint, metallic tang in the air suddenly sharpened, like old blood. The memories. It takes them. Not just the facts, but the feelings. The loves, the hates, the triumphs, the sorrows. All the threads that weave a person into being. And when they are gone, when the tapestry is unraveled, the vessel is ready for something else. My mind reeled. All those forgotten moments, those blank spaces in my recent past, those feelings of disorientation, they weren't just vanishing, they were being consumed. My identity, Marcus Blackwood, the academic, the recluse, the man who loved dusty books and quiet contemplation, was being systematically dismantled. It wasn't the fear of death, but the fear of something far worse. The fear of non-existence while still breathing, still walking. To be a ghost in my own skin. Generations of Blackwoods, all living under the same roof, all unknowingly feeding the same parasite. How many empty vessels had this house contained? How many had simply faded away, their stories devoured, their lives reduced to a final vacant stare? My determination, though tinged with despair, solidified. I wouldn't be another entry in its grim ledger. I wouldn't become an empty vessel. The truth, horrifying as it was also a weapon. I knew what I was fighting now, and I knew it was fighting for my very soul. My mind reeled, the entity's chilling consumption of my identity a stark, undeniable reality. Marcus Blackwood, the academic, the recluse, the man who loved dusty books and quiet contemplation. He was being systematically devoured. Not just forgotten, but erased. The thought was a cold, sharp blade twisting in my gut, far worse than mere amnesia. This wasn't a passive decay. It was an active, malevolent hunger. The fleeting glimpses, the half-formed images that occasionally surfaced. They were not random. They were fragments, breadcrumbs left by my own fading self, or perhaps by some ancestral echo pointing towards a defense. A countermeasure. A way to sever this parasitic connection before I was nothing more than an empty vessel. My search became a frantic, desperate scramble. I tore through the manor's forgotten wings, the dust motes dancing in the meager light like mocking spirits. I'd started in the archives, a place that once felt like sanctuary, but now seemed to hold only the ghosts of what I'd lost. Then, the library, pulling down ancient tomes whose bindings cracked like old bones, searching for any mention of the family, its history, its curse. My fingers, raw and smudged with grime, traced across brittle parchment, deciphering faded script, my eyes burning from the strain. I wasn't looking for a cure, not exactly. I was looking for a weapon, a forgotten instruction, a key. Of one even older, its pages filled with elegant, archaic script that took me hours to even begin to parse. The language was almost a dialect of its own, but the sketches were unmistakable. They depicted the manor, but also strange geometric diagrams, astrological symbols I didn't recognize, and that serpentine knot. One particular drawing caught my eye. A crude map, showing a section of the manor's foundations I'd never known existed. It pointed to an area beneath the old service wing, long since sealed off and forgotten. A last resort. That sounded exactly like what I needed. A heavy, iron-reinforced door, almost entirely swallowed by a buildup of earth and rubble. The serpentine knot was crudely carved into its rusted surface. It was bolted from the outside with a mechanism that looked like it hadn't been touched in centuries. A series of sliding iron bars and a massive corroded padlock. It took me hours, fueled by a frantic primal fear, to clear the debris and force the ancient mechanism. My shoulders screamed, my hands bled, but I didn't stop. When the last bolt finally scraped open with a groan that echoed like a dying beast, I pushed the door inward. This was it. The place of gathering. It wasn't a grand chamber, but a long, low-ceilinged room, wider than I expected. The walls were bare, save for the pervasive damp and a few more carvings of the serpentine knot. The floor was packed earth, uneven and gritty under my boots. This wasn't just a physical lockdown. It was a spiritual one. A place meant to contain something, or protect against it. My light swept over the central slab. It was covered in more of the intricate, disturbing symbols I'd seen in the journal, along with a shallow, circular depression at its center. And there, etched into the stone around the depression, were the instructions. Not in the archaic script, but in a simpler, more direct series of pictograms and a few translated words scrawled in a later hand, a desperate annotation from a Blackwood who had understood the threat. I knelt, my breath catching in my throat as I deciphered them. The ritual was clear. It required a piece of the entity's essence, a focal point, and then a sacrifice. Not of blood, not directly, but of memory. A deliberate, targeted offering of a cherished memory, placed into the depression, to be consumed by the slab, which would then act as a conduit, a mirror, reflecting the entity's hunger back upon itself. It would sever the connection, but at a cost. Not one that is merely pleasant, but one that defines you, that anchors you. To offer less is to offer nothing. A memory of profound love or joy. To lose it forever. My entire identity was built on such moments, such anchor points. To deliberately choose one, to tear it out and offer it. But the alternative was total erasure. A blank slate. A walking ghost. I looked at the symbols, the central depression, the stark, unsettling instructions. This wasn't a cure. It was a desperate gamble. The entity was consuming me piecemeal. This was the fear of choice, of an impossible decision. But as I traced the serpentine knot on the stone, I knew there was no other path. It seeped into the floorboards, ghosted along the long, empty tables, and settled in the marrow of my bones. The air itself felt thin, scrubbed clean of warmth, of life, leaving behind only the metallic tang of old fear. I stood by the cracked window, gazing out at the skeletal trees, their branches clawing at a sky the color of bruised plums. The silence wasn't empty. It hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration, like a distant, massive engine idling. To lose it forever. But the alternative was total erasure. I closed my eyes, picturing the intricate pathways of my own mind, a labyrinth of experiences, facts, emotions. Which one could I sacrifice? Not a core memory, not the bedrock of who I was, but something significant enough to satiate the hunger, something that had shaped me but no longer defined me. A flicker, a memory of the karmic engine theory. Years of my life spent hunched over dusty tomes, poring through obscure texts, writing endless equations on chalkboards that now felt impossibly far away. The project had consumed me, promised a grand understanding of causality, only to collapse under its own weight, leaving me with nothing but exhaustion and a profound sense of failure. It was a dead end. Perhaps in sacrificing it, I could prune a withered branch, making the rest of the tree stronger. The idea solidified, a terrible resolution. My breath hitched. As I focused on that specific mental construct, a pressure started to build behind my eyes, a low thrumming that vibrated through my skull. The hum in the mess hall intensified, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to emanate from the very floor beneath my feet. It wasn't a simple act of recall. It was an act of deliberate excision. The entity was here, drawn by the scent of my intent. I pushed back, erecting mental barriers around the more cherished parts of my past. My early childhood home, the scent of my mother's baking, the worn leather of my grandfather's armchair. These were mine, untouchable. I funneled my will, all my remaining mental energy, towards the karmic engine memory, pushing it forward, offering it like a sacrificial lamb. I could feel the tendril of the entity, now thicker, more insistent, latching onto the memory. But it wasn't just taking. I realized with a horrifying clarity that it was also imprinting. This wasn't just a thief. It was a parasite, seeking to overwrite me entirely. This was the true battle for the self. It wasn't enough to give. I had to fight to ensure what it left behind didn't corrupt the rest. My body trembled, a fine tremor that shook my hands and knees. I could hear a faint scraping sound, like claws on stone, moving around the perimeter of the room. It was trying to distract me, to break my concentration. I clamped my jaw shut, focusing harder. I visualized the memory of the karmic engine as a dense, self-contained sphere, severing its connections to everything else. I pushed it towards the entity, a deliberate offering, but with a mental boundary, a wall of pure will, to prevent its insidious residue from spreading. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. A chair clattered to the floor somewhere nearby. Nothing more. The pressure in my head intensified to an agonizing degree, like a band of iron tightening around my temples. I felt the memory rip away, a searing phantom pain that left a gaping hole in its wake. For a moment, A profound emptiness settled in my mind where the karmic engine theory, its years of research, its failures, had once been. It was gone. It was a terrifying, disorienting sensation, like losing a limb you didn't know you had. But then, a strange quiet descended. The scraping stopped. The heavy, acrid smell dissipated. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, and my body ached as if I'd run a marathon. I was still Marcus. My name still resonated in my mind. The memories of my family, the purpose of my current research, the feel of the rough floorboards beneath my feet. They were all there. But a part of me was undeniably gone. I had paid the price. And in doing so, I had glimpsed the true nature of the collector. It wasn't just a devourer. It was a weaver of foreign threads, seeking to replace the self, piece by agonizing piece. This wasn't merely about survival. It was about fighting for the very integrity of my being. And I had just won the first terrible round. The air hung thick with the smell of institutional disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, a cloying combination that made my stomach churn. I sat at a long metal table, the cold surface seeping into my forearms, my gaze unfocused on the chipped linoleum floor. Around me, other figures moved, their faces blurred, their voices a low, unintelligible murmur like a distant tide. I registered them as guards, perhaps a medic, a man in a rumpled suit who kept trying to catch my eye. None of them mattered. What mattered was the hollow space behind my eyes, the gaping void where something profound had been. The memory of the karmic engine theory, its years of painstaking research, the elegant architecture of its logic, the very fabric of my intellectual identity. It was gone. Not forgotten, but erased. I could feel the edges of the wound, raw and aching, a phantom limb of the mind. It was as if a vital organ had been surgically removed, leaving only the scar tissue of its absence. I knew it was gone, yet I couldn't remember what it was. A cruel paradox. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the plastic cup of lukewarm water. The tremor wasn't from fear, not anymore. It was a residual vibration, a nervous system recalibrating after being violently rewired. The pressure in my head had subsided, but a dull throb remained, a constant reminder of the tearing. I had survived, yes. The house, the entity, the relentless assault on my mind. I had walked away. But what had walked away was not entirely Marcus. A colleague, a woman with kind, weary eyes, approached the table. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "Marcus, are you with us?" I turned to her, her face a familiar yet strangely indistinct blur. I knew her. I knew her name, her role, our shared history in the academic world. But the emotional resonance, the depth of our connection, felt muted, like a radio signal fading in and out. "I'm here," I managed, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. My voice sounded raspy, unused. She pulled up a chair, her movements slow and deliberate. "They found you. Near the old gate. You were disoriented." He paused, his gaze searching mine, as if looking for something he couldn't quite name. "Can you tell us what happened, Marcus? Anything at all?" I looked away towards the scuffed wall. What could I tell her? That a malevolent presence, woven from the very stones of my ancestral home, had systematically devoured my memories, my sense of self? That it had tried to make me an empty vessel, a living ghost? She wouldn't understand. She couldn't. The house was a predator, and I was its prey. But I had fought back. I had done something. The memory of the final confrontation, the moment of decision, was a jumble of fractured images, a cacophony of sensation. A counterforce, perhaps. Or was it simply the entity's own energy, twisted and turned against it? The man in the rumpled suit, An interrogator, by the looks of him, cleared his throat. "Marcus, we need details. What did you see? Who else was there? We've been through the property, found nothing out of the ordinary save for the state of disrepair." Nothing out of the ordinary. The absurdity of it made a bitter laugh catch in my throat. They saw only brick and mortar, dust and decay. They didn't see the hunger that resided within the walls, the ancient, insatiable appetite for identity. It's quiet now. But was it truly gone? Or had it merely retreated, satiated by the feast it had consumed from my mind? The thought sent a chill through me, deeper than the cold metal of the table. I felt a strange, unsettling clarity now, a sharpened perception of the world that hadn't been there before. The hum of the lights, the subtle scent of rust beneath the disinfectant, the minute shifts in the air currents. They all registered with an almost painful intensity. It was as if, in losing so much, I had gained something else. A heightened awareness, perhaps, or a new kind of emptiness, one that echoed with the entity's own silent vigilance. The interrogator pressed on. "What do you mean, it's quiet? Was there an intruder? A disturbance?" I shook my head slowly. No intruder. Only the house. I looked at my hands again. They still trembled. But it wasn't fear. It was a resonance, a vibration, the cost of survival. My identity was a patchwork quilt now, stitched together with threads of memory and gaping holes of oblivion. I was Marcus, yes, but a Marcus reshaped, redefined by the crucible of that house. A Marcus who carried the echoes of something ancient and terrible within him. As I sat there, trying to reconstruct the shattered pieces of my recent past, a subtle shift occurred. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. More like a resonance, a lingering hum just beneath the threshold of hearing, a promise of something that had not truly departed. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. They just saw a man, shell-shocked and disoriented, trying to recover. They didn't see the new tenant in my mind, the quiet echo of the entity that had devoured so much, leaving behind a subtle, insidious mark. I had escaped the house, but the house, or a piece of its hungry essence, had come with me. The price of my survival wasn't just the memories I'd lost. It was the transformation of what remained. I was free, but I was also altered. And as I stared at the chipped linoleum, I wondered if the entity was truly dormant, or merely waiting for the opportune moment to finish what it had started from within.